Hey guys, my name's Pocket and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about the changes on the PBE, specifically focused on the new and altered runes. These will be released officially in the preseason, but they've been on the PBE a while now and I've got quite a bit of playtime on them. So we're just going to be going over exactly what the changes are, which runes are the same, which runes are different, which runes are new, and hopefully talk about some of the implications of these changes, how it's going to affect the game, and how it might affect certain champions and playstyles. So I've mucked these up into the little sections. First, we're going to talk about changed keystones. Then we're going to talk about the changes to sustain runes, specifically healing. Then we'll talk about changes to mana runes. And then we're going to go over what exactly the difference is between cooldown reduction and haste, with a specific focus on how this has affected certain runes that used to grant cooldown reduction, but now they grant some form of haste. We'll also look at runes that still have cooldown reduction so that we can really get a feel for what these changes mean for the game. So to start off, we'll look at keystones. In fact, this is actually pretty easy. Only one keystone has had significant changes, and this is probably unsurprising to a lot of you. It's Conqueror. Conqueror has undergone a lot of changes in its lifetime, and this one is actually relatively minor, but it should be pretty significant in how it changes the game when you look at all the other rune changes as well. So to start off, it stacks exactly the same as it does now. Abilities and melee auto attacks grant 2 stacks, ranged auto attacks grant 1 stack. It also gives the same amount of adaptive force per stack. However, the healing has been significantly nerfed. It now only heals 9% for melee champions and 6% for ranged champions. A really important thing to note about this specific change is that the ranged healing hasn't been nerfed as much as the melee healing. So whereas the melee has gone from 15 to 9, ranged has only gone from 8 to 6. This means that this is a much stronger nerf to those melee Conqueror users, and it might lead for some more playstyles with ranged Conqueror, but it is still actually a nerf to Conqueror, even for ranged champions. Now, this change to Conqueror leads us pretty nicely into the changes for sustain runes. Specifically, the changes apply to Bloodline and Ravenous Hunter. Legend Bloodline is a scaling rune which grants you lifesteal. Now, the change to Bloodline is pretty simple. It's just been nerfed. The maximum number of legend stacks that you could have with Bloodline was 20, but now it is only 15. What this means is that in the late game, when you will have max stacked your Bloodline will be 25% less effective. So it's a pretty significant nerf, but it's important to note that it will scale at the same rate. So when you were to have gotten 15 stacks on the old Bloodline, you will have the exact same amount of lifesteal as when you got 15 stacks on the new Bloodline, but the new Bloodline will simply cap out there. So in the early and mid game, it's probably not going to change too much, but it's a 25% nerf in the mid to late game when you fully stacked your Legend Bloodline. And I think that's where a lot of this is going with Riot. They're trying to nerf the huge amount of late game sustain that some champions and some playstyles can grant. Now with Ravenous Hunter, they've gone even a little bit further. The sustain per stack has been nerfed from 2.5% to 2%, but also the base sustain has been nerfed from 1.5% to 1%. This means that instead of 14% ability healing when fully stacked, it now maxes out at 11. They've also made another very significant change. Previously, the healing was reduced to 1/3 for area of effect damage. However, this has been removed, and now the healing is reduced to 1/3 when you're fighting non-champions. This has some quite significant implications, specifically to top laners and junglers. Top laners that used to want to head down and kill the Rift Herald, and junglers who will be constantly attempting to fight between sustain and staying in the jungle for a better farm, are really going to have to contend with this massive nerf. It's still going to have an effect on all the other lanes, of course, but I think that's where it's really going to come into its own, and this nerf is going to be most significant on those top laners that want lots of sustain or even to go and counter jungle, and those junglers that are relying on Ravenous Hunter for really good clear speeds. Now, other sustain focused runes have been left mostly the same. These include Taste of Blood, Second Wind, Grasp of the Undying, and Fleet Footwork, among others. So it looks like they were targeting the scaling runes specifically, rather than things that are meant to be more lane focused. Now, these sustain runes have all focused on health, but there's also been a change to our favorite mana sustain rune, and that's Presence of Mind. Presence of Mind still restores a percentage of your maximum mana or energy on champion takedown, but this has been nerfed from 20% to 15%. Also, the passive that gave it a 100 bonus maximum mana per takedown up to a maximum of 500 extra mana has been completely removed. Instead now, dealing damage to an enemy champion increases your mana regen. Again, this seems to be a move to reduce its late game power with this massive extra mana pool and bring it back to being a more lane focused rune, where if you're getting into lots of fights or you're very good at poking and bullying in your lane, you're going to be rewarded by better mana regen. Whereas in the late game where fights are more sporadic, you're not going to have any extra mana than if you didn't have this rune. Other mana runes like Biscuits and Mana Flow Band are completely unchanged. So now we're done with sustain, we have to look at the next topic, and that is all the changes to abilities that previously granted cooldown reduction. As many of you know, most cooldown reduction is now haste. The difference between this is actually quite significant. Whereas cooldown reduction was a simple percentage reduction in the cooldown of an ability, that is to say if you have an ability that has a 10-second cooldown, but you give yourself 10% cooldown reduction, then you will take 1 second off that cooldown and it will now have a 9-second cooldown. This is pretty simple, pretty easy to understand, but it has some flaws. The biggest of which is the 1% cooldown reduction when you only have 0% cooldown reduction is actually not as powerful as 1% cooldown reduction when you already have 40% cooldown reduction. Now, the reasons for this are a little mathematical, and I'm going to pull up a segment from my NAMI guide where we talked about why the old Cosmic Insight that increases your cooldown reduction by 5% actually leads to you being able to cast more than 9% more abilities. So let's imagine that we have an ability that has a 10-second cooldown. This means that at 0% cooldown reduction, we can use that ability 6 times per minute. Now, let's imagine that we've chosen the Cosmic Insight rune, so immediately we have 5% cooldown reduction. That means that the ability will now have a 9.5-second cooldown. Therefore, a little bit of maths will show that we can use just over 6.3 abilities per minute this time. And that means that we can actually use 5.2% more abilities with our 5% cooldown reduction. Now, however, let's assume that we have 40% cooldown reduction already on the same ability, which means that we have a 6-second cooldown, and that means that we can use 10 abilities per minute. If we then give ourselves the Cosmic Insight buff of 5% cooldown reduction, taking us to 45%, our cooldown will become 5.5 seconds. And with a 5.5 second cooldown, we can actually use just over 10.9 abilities per minute. Now, if we look at that, 10 abilities per minute with a 40% cooldown reduction and over 10.9 abilities per minute with a 45% cooldown reduction, we can actually see that you can use over 9% more abilities per minute by giving yourself just 5% extra cooldown reduction. This means that 5% cooldown reduction at 40% cooldown reduction is much more important and much more powerful than 5% cooldown reduction at 0% cooldown reduction. So hopefully you're going to be able to follow that, but the basics are that the more cooldown reduction you get, the more 1% cooldown reduction is actually worth. This is why they previously had to have a cooldown reduction cap. Because of this exponential growth in the importance of cooldown reduction as you approach 100%, you simply have to cap it out or people will end up with infinite cooldown reduction. Haste is meant to fix this issue. Haste is tied to the number of extra abilities that you can cast. So as I talked about in the previous section when we looked at how many extra abilities can you cast per minute, this is what haste is looking at. If you have 10 haste, you will be able to cast 10% more abilities in any given time frame than somebody with 0 haste. This means that the amount of extra abilities that you can cast as you build more haste is linear and not exponential. This means that it won't get out of control, and they've actually made the amount of haste that you can have completely unlimited. This means that using a relatively typical build on somebody like a Seraphine or a Sona, I've been able to get upwards of 133 haste, which is somewhat comparable to around 60% cooldown reduction. So what does this mean for runes? Well, the first and most important rune change I think is to Transcendence. Previously, Transcendence granted 10% cooldown reduction at level 10. It also had a passive that turned excess cooldown reduction above the previous cooldown reduction cap into adaptive force. Now, however, Transcendence gives us 5 ability haste at level 5 and a further 5 ability haste at level 8, meaning that you get an overall 10 ability haste. Obviously, because ability haste has no cap, the passive that turned excess cooldown reduction into adaptive force no longer exists. Instead, it has a secondary passive that only activates at level 11. After level 11, champion takedowns will reduce the remaining cooldown of all of your basic abilities, this means Q, W, and E, by 20%. Now, as we talked about, 10 ability haste isn't as strong as 10% cooldown reduction, so in that way, this rune has been nerfed. However, you're getting it much earlier than you used to, which especially especially for ADCs and supports who don't scale with level as quickly, could be quite a significant change. And also, pretty much anyone that wants to use this rune that has very high cooldown basic abilities, such as Samira's W, which has over 30-second cooldown, or Seraphine's 26-second shield cooldown. These champions are really going to benefit from the level 11 passive, which means these very, very useful but very, very high cooldown abilities will get a significant amount of their cooldown refunded during team fights. I think overall, Transcendence is going to be a little more niche, but for the champions that it really works on, it's going to be even more powerful than it used to be. The next rune that we're going to talk about is Cosmic Insight. Now, this rune was incredibly powerful in the old cooldown reduction system. It gave you not only 5% cooldown reduction, but also 5% maximum cooldown reduction, alongside cooldown reduction for things other than abilities such as items, trinkets, and summoner spells. Now, however, it simply gives you 15 summoner spell haste and 10 item haste. This means that it is a lot stronger for your summoner spells, and relatively stronger for your items as well. But it actually offers no ability haste. So for ability focused champions, this is just completely changed. In this way, I expect to see Cosmic Insight actually on some top laners that really want that low teleport cooldown, but I expect that enchanters that would have previously taken Cosmic Insight, such as Sona or Nami, really are just not even going to want to think about this rune. I also think that it might be quite popular on junglers. That 15 summoner spell haste does apply to Smite. This means that you're going to have Smite much more regularly, and especially in solo queue games where fights can be a bit more sporadic and knowing when to take dragon is less about planning for the future and more about taking advantage of an opportunity. It's just going to be great if your Smite is up more often, and those opportunities to safely secure dragon and baron are more common. There are also some pretty strong active items now, which we're going to talk about in my next video, so it'll be interesting to see if that plus 10 item haste might be enough for certain champions that are going to be relying on these massive item power spikes to take this rune just for that. And on the topic of items, our next rune is Ingenious Hunter. Previously, Ingenious Hunter gave item cooldown reduction, specifically only to active items, and it gave up to 40% cooldown reduction when it was max stacked. Now, however, it's going to grant 15 item haste plus an additional 10 item haste per stack, up to 5 stacks. That's a potential for 65 item haste, which is relatively comparable. Frankly, I think they wanted to keep this rune pretty much where it was, and I don't expect that it's going to change too much. I'm still fully expecting to see this rune be a must pick when you have Glacial Augment, but like we talked about with Cosmic Insight, there are some active items that have some pretty strong abilities in the item rework, and I'll be very interested to see if this can make a comeback on champions that previously would have taken Ravenous Hunter, and maybe now they'll want to have that item cooldown reduction because they don't feel like Ravenous Hunter is giving them what they need. Now, still in the Hunter line, we've also got Ultimate Hunter. Ultimate Hunter is the black sheep of the group, so to speak, and it is the only rune that I know of. In fact, I think it's the only thing that I know of that still actually gives cooldown reduction. In fact, it hasn't changed whatsoever. You get 5% reduced cooldown on your ultimate, an additional 4% per stack up to 5 stacks. This gives up to a 25% cooldown reduction just on your ultimate ability. I'm interested to see if this is an oversight. I haven't seen Riot talk about it. Maybe they just thought it's kind of good where it is and they don't really need to do anything there. On the other hand, they could have liked that cooldown reduction doesn't scale linearly, and maybe they wanted to make sure that this rune had better scaling into the late game and wasn't so useful early on. Either way, we'll see if this changes, but right now it's in the list of runes that haven't changed at all. And our final cooldown rune change is actually the little cooldown rune shard. It's that tiny little 10% cooldown reduction that you can choose alongside adaptive force or attack speed. Now, however, instead of that 10% scaling cooldown reduction, which was based on your level, it gives up to 8 ability haste based on your level. Now, 8 ability haste is nowhere near as good as 10% cooldown reduction, so this is just an absolute flat out nerf. I imagine with ability haste being uncapped, that ability focused champions, and especially ability focused champions that don't rely on their damage so much, like supports, would have taken this pretty much all the time if it was giving anywhere near 10% cooldown reductions power. So the nerf is more than likely just to try and cancel that out. I'm interested to see where it will come into play. I've been doing some testing, and at the moment I can't quite tell whether I want that cooldown reduction on my enchanter supports or if I want that extra damage in lane that you get from the adaptive force shard. I think it might be quite useful on some tanks though, and I think we're just going to have to see with this one. And now, finally, let's talk about the one and only new rune. The new rune is called Legend Destroyer, and as you can probably guess, it's in the legend line of the Precision tree. Like the other legends other than Bloodline, it has a maximum of 10 stacks, and each stack gives you 2% bonus armor and bonus magic penetration. This means that you get a bonus 20% armor and magic penetration when it's fully stacked. This means that this scaling rune can be incredibly powerful. I expect to see it on everybody from Teemo to Darius, and maybe even some of the ADCs that don't scale with attack speed so well, like Jhin and Senna, who really like that armor penetration. Something I want to note about this rune is that the description in the client is kind of wonky. It reads, you get 2% bonus armor and bonus magic penetration, and I've seen a number of people misunderstand this to mean that you're going to get 2% bonus armor, the defensive stat, and 2% bonus magic penetration, the offensive stat, meaning that this would be really good for magic dealers going into physical damage dealers. However, that's not the case. They are both the penetration stat. It should actually read something along the lines of you get 2% bonus armor penetration and 2% bonus magic penetration. Hopefully, if anybody was a little confused, that would clear that up for you. And I think we're done. That is all the rune changes currently on the PvE. And while balance may be changed here and there, I'm not expecting the mechanics of these changes to be altered before it goes live. So hopefully this is going to give you a heads up on exactly what to expect so that you can understand these runes as soon as they go live. Once again, make sure to hit that sub button so you can catch my next videos that are going to focus on Seraphine and all of the item changes that are coming alongside these rune changes.